All right, so thank you very much. Are we all here? Hemanta? Where's Hemanta? Is he here?
Oh no, he's coming late.
Oh, he said he's coming late. Okay. And we have some other colleagues that are just arriving to the airport and are on their way here. So first of all, thank you very much for being here. And I will be wearing a mask because I have a little bit of a cold and I'm coughing a little, so I don't want. It's not COVID, don't worry. I got myself tested, but I don't want anybody to get sick. So first of all, and to my panelists and to everybody who is here, just to let you know that this is a hybrid meeting. So there will be people connected from all over the world to this session. That thanks to technology, ironically, thanks to technology, we will be connected. But first of all, I always do this exercise for my mental health and for the awareness of the people. So I would like you to invite all of those who are here with me in the panel and here in the room to take 5 deep breath intakes. So we can all become here and aware of this session and this moment, please. So let's begin individually. Just take 5 deep breaths. Thank you very much. We're surrounded by a world of information, by a world of lots of information, whether they're good or bad. And that's why I want to do this simple exercise to bring our attention to this very moment, to share the privilege of being together in a world community, but to share this privilege of discussing these very important topics. So it's been a lot of years after 1972, the first meeting that took place here in Stockholm. Thank you for all the warm welcoming of all the people here. There are so many angles from which we can see this evolution. 50 years it's easy to say, but it's hard to transit. So many things have happened in our world and so many angles we can see this evolution of what happens. You name it, gender, war, pandemic, so many angles where we can see it. In this session, what we will try to do is bring another angle. See how all this evolution has an impact or has impacted on the other ways around, how the multilateral environmental policy has been shaped. We will discuss about climate change from a multilateral space, which is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also talk about biodiversity from this multilateral body that is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Its interlinkages and its connection, but that go beyond that only relationship, and that their experience will help us understand all the connections, all the evolution, the impacts, the people's demands, and etc. So I will ask our panelists to introduce themselves for those who do not know them yet, although they're very well known around the world. But before you start your presentation, please introduce yourself. And I will try to do my best to control the time. So let's begin with no more delay. I will ask my colleague and friend, please, lady.
Good afternoon to all of you. I'm assigned to do kind of like an opening to set our context. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Lidi Nakpil. I'm with the Asian People's Movement on Death and Development. My colleagues and I have traveled all the way from the Philippines to be here. For me, this is just the 3rd time I've traveled out of the Philippines since the COVID pandemic, and this 3 times was just in the last 3 months. There's so much to catch up on since our global lockdown for the pandemic, and it's really a big privilege and a blessing to be here with all of you. We started our movements, the movements I came from in the Philippines. I'm from in the Philippines. We started really working closely on climate change issues just over 15 years ago. Quite late, actually. We're kind of a late bloomer on climate change. Before that, we were in our struggle against the dictatorship, which we overthrew. in the mid-80s, our struggles for economic justice against the debt crisis, which is still a crisis that's going on. But we realized that, the climate crisis is one of the biggest threats to human civilization and life on Earth as we know it. Over 15 years ago, we pledged to be really active contributors to the struggle against climate change. And since then, I've found myself every year talking about the urgency of acting on climate, and it becomes even more urgent as each year passes by. And we all know why, because we have just a narrow window of time to act against climate change, to prevent climate catastrophe. And with each passing year and with each delay of governments, of corporations, of elites, those who are primarily responsible for climate change, with each delay, hundreds of millions of more lives are threatened every year. And not just threat or risk, we're also talking actually of loss, huge losses of lives, of homes, of infrastructures, of crops, of livelihoods, of jobs. And each year, we see some successes and victories as we grow our movements, as we become strong, we become smarter in fighting the fossil fuel industry, in fighting false solutions. But also each year they, meaning the perpetrators of climate change, keep throwing new challenges against us. Last year in Glasgow, we celebrated, in Paris, we celebrated an important win, and that was enshrining the goal of keeping temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, because that was not acknowledged by governments for a long, long time. Last year in Glasgow, we celebrated a win where for the first time, in how many COPs were there before that? In 25 COPs. It was the 26th COP. For the first time, COP outcomes actually mentioned fossil fuels in the document. That was a win, but also another setback, because a few months before Glasgow, they started talking about unabated fossil fuels. Yeah, this issue of abatement is a huge issue because it pertains to one of the biggest false solutions challenge we are facing, and that is about geoengineering and carbon capture and storage and other technologies that perpetrates a myth that you can actually take out greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order to compensate for continuing to pollute the earth. Also, sometime in the last 2 years, they came up with another major challenge to counter our challenge to call for decarbonization and zero emissions by at least, if not earlier, the mid-century globally. And this is now the net zero. And so we have net zero as a banner call of governments and corporations just to prove that they are climate champions. So every inch we make in our victory against climate change, they keep hitting us with new challenges. And one thing that's going to come up also at COP27 in Egypt is in our call for an effective response against loss and damage, which is one issue that we have been raising for many years. They're also going to come up again with more market solutions, this time to address loss and damage, including insurance systems and the like, as against our call for actual reparations, not just for loss and damage, but also for us to build capacity and resilience in the South, and also to complete successfully a just and equitable transition out of fossil fuels in the South. So this is one of the issues that's going to come up at the COP, at COP27, as we also push for just and equitable and rapid transition out of fossil fuels, as we are going to call for ecological restoration, as we are going to call for real zero emissions reduction, real zero emissions rather than just simply net zero, which is a perpetuation of a myth that there is any kind of solution that will allow continued pollution of the Earth's atmosphere. So these are the challenges we face. And now I'm going to ask Gadir to also mention the other challenges that are so interlinked with our challenge in the fight against climate change, and this time in the struggle to protect the biodiversity of our planet.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lady, for that excellent explanation of providing us with information about climate. And as you mentioned, when we think about emissions, sometimes, and for some strange reason, we forget that there's whole ecosystems, there's life within, a bit below those emissions. There are forests, oceans, all sorts of ecosystems and life. And all that is dealt in another convention, that is the Convention on Biological Diversity. That again, I say for some strange reasons it's disconnected from the climate debate. So just to, in very, very brief, in 2010, some Aichi targets, what they called Aichi targets, were agreed internationally, globally. They were supposed to be a set of targets that would guide humanity towards dealing with with all the problems related to biodiversity, you name it, terrestrial, water ecosystems, all sorts of ecosystems and problems related. As you could already foresee, or you could, I mean, it won't be a surprise to anybody, 10 years later, basically none of the Aichi targets were met. That's not really a surprise for anybody, that the multilateral spaces do not deliver what they promised they would. So right now, basically, we're at the stage that the Convention on Biological Diversity, since there is, I mean, the time of the Aichi targets is over, it has to decide on a whole global biodiversity framework. And what's happening right now is that the negotiations are just doing the same. We're ending up with a new set of goals, and governments are promising they will fulfill those goals after 30 years. But there is no accountability mechanism, and there is nothing that would really tell the world that this will be different than the last set of targets. And there are very important topics under discussion in the CBD. Not only, of course, the fact that forest, one of the elements, for example, is related to the protected areas. That, you know, that seems to be one of the center areas of the CBD, which is not, because the CBD has three objectives. One is the conservation of biological diversity, but the second one is the sustainable use of its components. And the third one is the benefit sharing, the benefit arising from the use of genetic resources. And because we have three objectives in the CBD, that's one of the reasons why, for example, the US did not want to become a party to the CBD. And this is not something simple. I mean, that's just a very important fact. There are very important elements discussed under the CBD that, well, Niklas and others will address, but to name them, synthetic biology, you know, the new generation of engineering the whole life on Earth. A very complex issue that is called digital sequence information. And it's precisely in these moments when we have to address those elements, because it's 10 years. 10 years ago, when, for example, these Aichi targets were addressed, the capacity of humanity, technological capacity to sequence life was totally different. We required millions and millions of dollars, weeks, all sort of laboratories. 10 years later, with a USB, with some hundreds of dollars, you can sequence life. So we're in a very different stage, not too many years after. And again, the panelists will address that with a lot more experience than I do. Just want to warn you about what's going to happen. Also, just as in climate, there are definitely lots of incoherences. One is that governments, when they go to these kind of meetings in the CBD, they claim to be putting millions and millions for biodiversity. They all claim that they're doing the best they can for biodiversity policies. But when you compare the billions of dollars put to destroy biodiversity, and you see them in numbers, then you realize there's something completely incoherent in what the multilateral spaces are trying to deliver. So basically, I just want to, of course, we can provide further details and numbers, but I just want to give you a hint that these multilateral spaces, after 50 years, they need to be accountable for. We need, and civil society needs to be aware of these things. And it's not easy to transmit these messages to from the privileged multilateral spaces to the grassroots organization, to the territories, to those dealing with the pressure of the decisions taken in these multilateral spaces. However, again, I'll give the space to the panelists, and I'll ask Teresa, please, to continue, because she will help us understand better some of the scenario related to false solutions. Please.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name's Teresa Anderson. I'm the global lead on climate justice for ActionAid International. We're a federation in 45 countries working for social justice and development. We're mostly, with a global South emphasis, but we work on issues of, humanitarian issues, agriculture, and of course, climate justice, climate change is right in the intersection of that. And so we have been very much following climate issues, agriculture issues, land rights for many years. And we got really, really concerned several years ago when we started to hear a lot of conversation about net zero targets. You've been hearing all this language of net zero being the basis of climate action. There's all this assumption that net zero targets are going to be necessary to get us to where we need to go to cool the planet. And it's generally accepted by most of media, governments, the public, business, even civil society, that net zero climate targets are synonymous with ambitious climate action. And so at COP26 climate negotiations in Glasgow last year, we saw the UK government really having a real push, really pressuring all the other governments, all the businesses they could to make net zero announcements. So we had the UK, we had France, the EU, Canada, New Zealand, even Sweden declaring net zero targets, most of them saying net zero by 2050. In Sweden's case, net zero 2045. And this was being celebrated as, yay, look, we're on our way. And we saw the corporations doing the same thing. Shell, BP, wow, they're declaring net zero targets. Isn't that cool? The cement industry, Heidelberg, the mining industry, Vale, the dairy industry, Arla, and Qantas Airlines, all of them declaring net zero. So this all sounds great. The more the merrier, right? This must be really good, everybody assumes. Well, you may be guessing that I'm about to tell you that no, this is not good news, because what we really know is that net zero targets are problematic on so many levels. They're being basically used to greenwash business as usual. They're mostly relying on technology that doesn't even exist yet. And they're really already driving and are going to drive much more land grabs, especially in the global South. And above all, they will fail to prevent runaway global climate change. Now let's take a step back and think. The real action that we need to cut emissions, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that needs to involve minimizing the total amount of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. I think nobody would disagree with that, right? And that, we know, means restructuring our systems, our energy systems, our agriculture systems, our housing, our transport, our industrial, our economic systems, and much more, as others on these panels earlier today have outlined. It means bringing greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere down as close as possible to near zero. And we also need to remember, we need to, protect and restore biodiverse ecosystems. And, on the pathway to getting this, we need real ambitious milestones for 2025. That's just 3 years' time. We need really strong milestones, that 2025, 2030, that get us really strongly on this path, because we don't have any time. And of course, we need our solutions to be equitable. So that means that the wealthy, polluting countries with the most historical responsibility for causing the climate crisis, they need to be the ones, along with the biggest corporations, the ones that need to act first, that need to do their fair share of climate action, while also providing climate finance to other countries in the global south who are most impacted by the climate crisis, but have done the least to cause the problem, and themselves need, to become resilient to impacts and transition to greener pathways. So we have an idea of what that solution to address the climate crisis is going to look like. And so we hear all this net zero stuff. Okay, this simple 2 words, that sounds good. Oh, does that not mean everything that I just described? Well, no, it doesn't. Net zero sounds a lot like zero, but it is not zero, And so, because to understand the very simple maths around net zero, just envision 3 sample scenarios of how you get to net zero. If I have 0 emissions minus 0 emissions, that is net zero emissions. If I have 10 tons of CO2 in the atmosphere minus 10 tons of CO2, that is also net zero CO2. And if I have 1,000 tons of CO2 and somehow subtract 1,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, that is also net zero CO2. So they sound the same, but actually they're 3 completely different pathways. And there's so many questions associated with how we got to that net zero, so we need to really scrutinize rather than take them at face value. So how big is that net? How big is the amount we've had to subtract to get to that net zero? How have we removed, or how are we supposed to remove that CO2 from the atmosphere? And in doing so, who is it going to impact? And is it even possible? Because the bigger the net, the greater the amount of carbon offsetting, the greater amount of carbon removal we're going to have to do, the greater amount of carbon capture and storage, theoretically, we're going to have to do. And that means that's the weaker the target. The bigger the net, the weaker the target, and the more dangerous it is. And in most cases, it implies heavy, heavy greenwash. So if we think about how we're going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we only really have one viable solution, and that is the biodiverse ecosystems of the planet, which we know that we have to protect and restore. But we also know that land on this planet is limited, and it doesn't compensate for the rate of CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere through our fossil fuels and other polluting schemes. And so basically, the world's fossil fuel companies are claiming to be green by saying we're going to plant trees, but actually the amount of land that they would require to plant those trees is utterly unfeasible. For example, Shell last year announced, they said, yes, we're going net zero, we're the solution. And then they said, well, we're not going to tell you exactly how we get to net zero between here and 2050, but we'll tell you that by 2030, so in 10 years' time, we're going to plant trees. So now you know that when you buy Shell petrol, you're protecting forests. You're actually saving the planet by buying our petrol, they tell you. So, but of course, when you look at what they're trying to do, we calculated the amount of land that they would require to offset their emissions, but just on their pathway to net zero, would require land that's 3 times the size of the Netherlands. Now, Royal Dutch Shell is a Dutch corporation, but they're not planning to, push the good people of Amsterdam and the Netherlands off their land. They're not planning to displace Dutch agriculture. No, they're planning to go into the middle of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and displace people and existing ecosystems there to plant new trees to claim that they are solving the climate problem. It's completely absurd. And so we know that that's just one corporation, and there are many others. And if you add up all of the net zero targets together, there is simply not enough land on the planet to offset all of the continued emissions that are planned under these absurd net zero targets. So we know that under net zero targets, it's going to be the global south that pays the price for carbon colonialism, yet again, for a crisis that they did very little to cause. So just to repeat myself, in conclusion, I want you to all go away with the clear message that net zero targets are dangerous and, basically greenwash business as usual. 2050 is clearly too little, too late, or even in Sweden, 2045. Their reliance on land to suck carbon out of the air is going to drive vast land grabs. And all of the net zero targets added together are more than the world can possibly provide. We need to scrutinize net zero targets, don't accept them at face value, and make sure that we, minimize their reliance on carbon removal from the atmosphere. Because what we really need to do is reduce greenhouse gases at source to real zero. And we all have to be careful not to get caught in the net. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for bringing our attention to how dangerous these apparent nice phrases or nice language, how dangerous they are. The net zero, the nature-based solutions, they apparently are a good thing. And that's the problem with the multilateral spaces. When they go there without any consultation of the people on the ground, without any real holistic analysis from a justice perspective, from a coherent perspective, they just make their all the way through the communities and cause displacement on all you mentioned. Thank you very much for that. So let's go to even more specific examples of how dangerous the multilateral spaces can become if we allow certain concepts or ideas to just spread there. So please, I'll ask Nicholas to go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Although in this setting you might be very well known, but for those who are online connected.
Thank you, Gadir, and thanks everyone. Yes, my name is Niklas Hellström. I'm actually Swedish, based here in Uppsala, and with What Next. And I've been also engaged for quite some time now in the climate sphere, both following the negotiations, but also working with colleagues in the movements on the various struggles outside and connected across. And I guess just a few reflections on one sort of, in a way, the extreme end of the extreme form of these dangerous distractions or false solutions that Teresa started to talk about as well, which is geoengineering. And I'm sitting next to Pat Mooney from ETC Group, who were really I would say the first ones to really see this coming way back, early 2000s, I suppose. Pat, you can fill in, and nobody took it seriously, really. And we had some meetings back then to kind of try to alert people, because we saw that, this is something that will probably become a real beast to fight, and hardly anyone kind of could take that seriously. It was more like, what is this? It's just too outrageous. Nobody can seriously take this, on, and we don't really need to bother. And now we're sitting here, and this is, I would say, one of the key messages for me today is to say that geoengineering is something that everybody needs to be learning quickly about, and also not just learning, but getting engaged on, whether whatever you're doing, because in my view, it's as scary as climate change, and it's something that will likely be unfolding in very nasty ways unless we as civil society and folks who are sort of alerted and have good values are really making up a good fight against this. It's very creepy, and it's also with the climate emergency becoming sort of something that people can almost flip into, from being sort of very negative and hesitant about, to be kind of, okay, we got to do something. So we need to counter that narrative. And just to kind of get some meat on the bones here and what we're actually talking about. So geoengineering is a basket term. It's something that is not just one particular technology, it's a set of technologies. What unites these technologies is the sort of scope, that you're actually doing something to counter something so vast like climate change, global warming, global heating in like one go. So to do that, of course, the technology response needs to be massive. It's about an intervention that alters whole continents or even the whole atmosphere as you intervene to put this countermeasure. And it's also intentional, right? People say, well, we're already doing geoengineering because we have climate change and we've changed a lot, lands have been, turned into land, agricultural lands and so on. We've always been changing the world, but, that is true. But what we're talking about here is a very targeted intervention, intentional as a measure to counter global change, global warming in this case, by certain actors and doing that in a very quick timescale as well. And of course, this raises some very, very fundamental questions around participation, about democracy, about who is to be part of this conversation. And when things are at stake that are absolutely irreversible and could create as much of a problem as the problem we're facing, is it any way we can really govern that? And many people are actually arguing no. And there's some really interesting movements around that I'll come back to. But before that, just to outline the kind of big brushstroke kinds of technologies in this basket, we have one set called carbon dioxide removal. So that's basically, we have too much carbon dioxide. Yes, we acknowledge that as a major problem. So let's pull it back. Let's pull it so much back that we're starting to reduce the warming significantly. Well, that's a massive drawdown, a massive pulling back. And how to do that? Well, there are some different ways. Let's plant trees, several times the size of India, for example, as has been proposed. Burn them so we get bioenergy, capture that through carbon capture storage, which isn't developed in any way yet. And that goes back to the unabated coal that Lydia talked about. CCS is pie in the sky technology so far. Let's assume it's going to be applicable in this vast scale, capture all these burnt trees, and then push it down into oil wells, empty oil wells, not push oil back up, which is actually what happens, and which is already being done, and keep it all there and basically pump carbon dioxide down into the ground. Or let's fertilize the oceans with iron to have massive algae blooms. And let's hope that these algae die, they sink down to the bottom of the sea, they get packed into the sediments, and they'll never come back. Then we're basically pumping carbon dioxide down. Of course, we're wrecking the seas, the ecology of the seas, the fisheries, everything. It's a huge gamble. So these are the sets of kind of removal technologies that people are still talking about. And of course, nothing seems to be working. But if they did, of course, the unintended consequences would be absolutely massive and impossible, inherently impossible to control. Now, the next set of technology under geoengineering is solar radiation modification or management or whatever you call it, solar geoengineering. I think Pat just mentioned this. And that is really one step up on the extreme kind of scale, right? So basically, let's not try to take away the carbon dioxide. Let's just mitigate, let's just try to compensate the effects of all this carbon dioxide by blocking the sun. Let's have the sun become less effective in warming. So we kind of put up some kind of band-aid here. So basically, let's mimic volcanoes. Let's spew out massive amounts of pollution really up in the stratosphere so we have some reflection of the incoming sunlight, enough to mitigate, to kind of make the heating less clear. And it actually works in the sense that we know volcanoes having decreased the average temperature for a year or two before these particles sink down. Gravity still works. Eventually they will hit the ground and the warming will pick up again. But if we then do this constantly, right, forever, because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. So we need to, if we do this, we need to continue forever, basically, for hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years, continuously. Now, the point here is, we're stuck in this kind of, the proponents of this say, look, we might not want to do this, but we might have to because, we're not taking real action. And it's kind of just giving us some time. It's an emergency brake. It's kind of this metaphor conveniently, like let's dial down, right? There's a knob. It's just kind of control. We just pump some stuff up there, and for a while we kind of scale down the temperature. We just have to agree on how much, which might be a political kind of issue, but the metaphor is that it's kind of very straightforward. Now, the metaphor or the actual real image one needs to have here is we're dealing with absolutely destabilized, disturbed, fucked up system, right? We have a climate that is going berserk. Now, we're going to intervene in that system by scaling that up. We're going to massively destabilize it further by pumping all these particles into the atmosphere. And of course, it's going to play out differently in different places. You're going to have more droughts at certain places. You're going to have the monsoon might flip. That's what happens. The average is irrelevant. Nobody lives in an average. People live in places. So the idea here is that we mess up with the system in a way that has never ever been done before, in a way that is irreversible. What happens if the monsoon flips? Well, you don't just get it back, right? It's just done. And you're putting yourself into a situation where if you stop, because the monsoon might be starting to flip, so panic stop, well, that might be worse, because then we have this termination shock. All of a sudden, these particles aren't blocking the sun. We continue to pollute, and boom, we have a temperature rise of, say, degrees in years, which no ecosystem can handle. So we basically tear everything apart in a way that is like the worst sort of weapon of mass destruction you could have ever imagined. So we're stuck. And this is what's going on now. This is what's becoming normalized. And we had a fight here in Sweden a year ago where a Harvard-based project called ScopeX was trying to do the first real-life experimentation of flying a balloon high up in the stratosphere to release some particles, not in dangerous amounts, but with the pretext was we got to study this so we understand how to do it if we need to scale up. But it was really crossing a red line of normalizing something that is just too dangerous to ever be conceived. So why do you need to do these kinds of tinkering and experiments and research when that will just take you down a slippery slope? So the reaction from civil society and researchers, but even more so the Sami people on whose lands this would be undertaken, was absolutely fierce. It was a beautiful coming together of these stakeholders or these parties. And it was a great fight that eventually, in just a few months, led to a partial victory where the Space Corporation, actually a state-owned corporation up in Kiruna who does fly these balloons, pulled back because they realized this was far from non-controversial, and they were starting to feel the heat. So the ScopeX project had to leave because they'd have nobody to fly their balloons. They're trying still. What was really beautiful here was that the Sami Council, together with, I think, 30 other indigenous peoples, they quickly got together, educated themselves. This is a new issue for most people. And everybody was instantly saying, look, this is absolutely horrible and completely against our worldviews. You don't mess with nature this way. And they all put up a big fight and took the fight from their lands in the north of Sweden to Harvard. They wrote a letter to the Harvard board and said, scrap this project, shut down ScopeX, which was also a really powerful way of shifting the sort of narrative and the site of contestation. But this is ongoing. And what's happening now is that this is not a negotiated issue in UNFCCC. Some people are thinking we should bring it in. There's a huge debate around governance because, how do we deal with this? We need to have a forum for actually talking about it, which is also a dangerous space, because when you talk about it in a way that is framed as, under what conditions do we do this, that we probably have to do because we don't take action on the mitigation side, it's really dangerous because you again normalize under the pretext of having a neutral conversation about governance. And the worst space to do that is probably UNFCCC, which is a geopolitical space dominated by the powers that are sort of promoting this or seeing this as a way out. And of course, this plays into the logic that Teresa just mentioned in terms of net zero being a way to continue, right? To continue polluting, continue with fossil fuels, continue with our defunct development model, and with the illusion that there's going to be some technology that comes in and fixes it. Of course, it won't. It will be in a worse situation, and that fuels the logic of course, jumping onto this in some panic state. But again, I think the conclusion from our end is that can never be such an option. It's just inherently ungovernable. And I want to conclude by saying that we need to be watching this spaces. UNFCCC is we have to really see where this takes us. CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has been a good space, and Pat can tell the story of how he and his colleagues at ECC Group conceived of and brought the idea of a moratorium into that space and succeeded. And it's still there 10 years plus down the line. That's actually an incredible achievement of civil society and allies in developing countries and some developed countries. And we need to fight that and keep that in that space. But it's also dangerous terrain as things are moving. But I also want to say, flag, and you can look that up, the international call for an international non-use agreement on solar geoengineering came in February this year. And it's a really interesting effort by now 350 scientists have signed on, social scientists, governance scholars, and they basically conclude it's ungovernable. For all these risks, it's a bad, you should never consider it. But on top of that, it's simply ungovernable. You can never have the sort of political consensus, the long-lasting arrangements that you need to govern something so absolutely dangerous. So you shouldn't even talk about it. Let's just agree we will never use it, and thereby we should never fund any research. We should never normalize. We should never allow these kinds of experiments that takes us towards this sort of abyss and down the slippery slope. So I'll stop there, and we can talk more.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Well. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for sharing that. And yes, stressing out that, for example, while there's a discussion in the UNFCCC, some parties that are also parties to the CBD ignore the decisions taken in the CBD about the moratorium, for example. And it's very scary to see that we're living in some sort of sci-fi world where some take decisions to affect the entire climate on territories and without any consultation or without any process to find any sort of even acceptance or even informing the territories. Thank you very much for that. So talking about the connections, I would like to welcome a friend and colleague here, just arrived from the airport. So she will briefly give us some of her thoughts and an explanation of the CBD from the youth perspective. And then I was thinking, the original plan was to take a break. We may not have time to take a break, but we will do a little stretching exercise to keep our attention. And then we will go into a final round of reflections. Please, Melina, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Gajer. Thank you, everyone. My name is Melina Sakiyama. I'm from Brazil, and I am one of the co-founders of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is the youth coordination platform at the Convention on Biological Diversity. And yeah, so as Gajer said, I just arrived, but I just wanted to bring up a little bit of the points. And I'm going to start with what you said, Nicholas, in terms of narrative. And I think we are dealing now with a very dangerous narrative in the sense that we are trying to look at everywhere else except of what needs to be done. And the Global Youth Biodiversity Network conducted like a global youth consultation on the vision for a future in harmony with nature for the past, I don't know, now with the pandemics, I lost count, but since 2017, because we were preparing for the negotiation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the next 10-year strategic plan for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the plan expired in 2020 because of the pandemics. We're still like forever negotiating that. And the expectation is that this is going to be a global framework for all, and that it should put biodiversity at the center of decision making so that every other decision should take into account its impacts and its consequences on biodiversity. So based on that, our youth constituency, we did this consultation process. And for young people, it's really interesting. Like, it was really like kind of saying the basics and going back to the obvious. So it was clear for the people that are working on the ground that what we need for a framework to be successful is that it has to be rights-based. It has to deal with, it has to balance and even the field. That means that we need to address inequalities, and it needs to sort of be it has to have means of implementation, meaning resources, inclusion, participation, and so on. And then what suddenly happened with the narrative is that although all the civil society movement are trying to bring the focus on the rights, on the equity, on the indirect drivers, they're causing the sort of multi-layered crisis that we're living in, right? Suddenly we start to hear terms like nature-based solutions and net zero approaches and synthetic biology and CRISPRs and all this miraculous sort of technology that is gonna solve everything. And it's becoming a very dangerous thing, especially so for the CBD, especially the net zero and the nature-based solutions started to pick up track. And now in the CBD, we have a framework that is called ecosystem-based approaches with clear guidelines and clear definitions on what that means, right? But they don't want to use that. They want to go and create a new framework, right? Because if you create a new framework, it's easier to co-opt everything that has been done and decide again, what do you mean by everything? And so it's been a real struggle, especially within the youth constituencies, because nature-based solutions looks nice. It sounds nice. It's very attractive, but there is not a definition yet. It was something that was started by IUCN, and they have a definition. But I mean, we know, I'm from Brazil. I know that these things mean nothing when it comes to implementation in my country. It doesn't mean if you have agreements or definitions, what happens on the ground is that we have weak governance, we have corruption, we don't have participation, we don't have legitimated process to involve people in the decision-making process. So what is it going to happen? It's going to happen another REG Plus. It's going to happen any other policies that are decided in very small rooms by very few people with very few diversity of people that think the same and think that this is going to work out in the whole of the world. So young people start to sort of pick up on those different narratives that are happening. And we have been doing a lot of capacity building and awareness raising, because it's been really difficult to keep up with the cooptation of narratives. And I think that's what I really would like to highlight here in this space, because the new terms and the new strategies that comes with a lot of ulterior interests or commercial interests or political interests from people in power is really much faster than what we can do as civil society in terms of explaining, demystifying, neutralizing the narratives and start to focus back again on what is important. And I think what is happening at the CBD at the moment is that we feel that we are kind of stating the obvious when our priorities are focused on rights and equity. And then at the beginning, the negotiators and the community were really sort of allergic towards the discussion on human rights and rights-based. But I think it's exactly what you mentioned, Nicholas, when there is a mobilization of different collectives and different people's movements, and coordination and alliance build up there, then we can start to change a little bit of the tone. And I think I'm not sure from the youth perspective, I feel that we have been partially successful in bringing up bringing the agenda of rights-based to elevate a little bit the level of this agenda within the CBD. So there was enough pressure like from the movements, from the different caucus, the women, the youth, the indigenous peoples, like civil society really came together to start putting pressure on the negotiations and on the narrative, right? And so I think like we are kind of sort of getting there. I don't know if it's gonna really like mean anything. We are still negotiating, but I just wanted to kind of like really bring the focus into the narrative, because I think like what sometimes we are so sort of like facing as civil society, we're facing so many fires. We need to like put down a lot of fires, and we can't keep attention into the overview and what is happening. And then like we cannot keep up with the coordination and the alliance and mobilization work that needs to be done as collective movements. And I think that this is really, really, really key for us to be able to counter, like to do counter work, like to really kind of like do the battle on the level of the narrative, because otherwise, like we are never gonna be able to sort of like fight this, because it's just gonna be too many new things coming in. And I just wanted to finish like with the importance of all your organizations and like your movements to really engaging dialogue and intergenerational partnerships with a lot of the youth collectives and the youth movements and groups that are coming in, because they are very active people. They have like the values and the principles in the right direction, but sometimes there is no experience. There is no experience with the history of activism, for instance, or like understanding how this kind of like conflict of interest, political, the B side of politics work. And like, especially in the global north, because there is this understanding that the institutions and the legal frameworks are still working, because in the South, it doesn't work. So we are born knowing that it's not going to work. So we are going to like think twice before we believe in something, right? But like what we have been experiencing, especially in these dialogues between Global South and Global North youth, is that there needs to be a lot more dialogue between these communities. And it would be really important that like experienced activists and NGO members also engage in dialogue with the youth groups, so that there is this share. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Melina. For bringing the important vision of the youth, but also the important elements you mentioned about narrative and how narratives being co-opted and how difficult it is to fight against those narratives that enjoy so many resources and money and, well, you name it. So in order to move to the next section of our session, and I will ask the Yemi, who is online, to get ready. And while Yemi is online and getting ready, our panelists will our next round of panelists will address. I'll just to briefly ask you, those who are here, and for us to stretch a little bit. Yeah, you can stand up, please. Let's stretch a little bit to keep the attention. I know that some of you have just arrived. It's not easy to deal with so much information, but let's make our whole bodies listen, not only the ears. And while we check and we ask Yemi to speak up and see if he's connected. Yemi, are you there?
Hello? Hello?
Hello, Yemi, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, we need more volume for Yemi because... All right, so let's go back to our seats now that we kind of stretched a little.
Hello?
Hi, Yemi. Can you hear us well?
Hear me?
Oh, we can see you and hear you. Very good.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Give me a minute then. I will.
Sure.
Okay, but I believe you were following the session, right? You were listening to us.
Yes, I was. Thank you.
Awesome. So, okay, this is another round where we will rely on the experience of our panelists to make some reflections in relation to what we mentioned. You know, this cooptation of the narratives, this this connection between the multilateral spaces. We're in a context of having a 50 years after an important meeting, many things have happened, and making an analysis of where we're standing right now after those 50 years. I don't know if it's a celebration or not. I won't put a label. But let's start with you, Yemi. If you can provide us some of your reflections, of course, related to the CBD, now that that's your field of expertise, and then we move on with other reflections. Please, Yemi, go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hadia. And also, yeah, it's great listening to the colleagues making their contributions. So I work with the African Civil Society Biodiversity Alliance. And one of the things that we've been focusing on is, of course, engagement with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. But during that engagement, one of the things that we've begun to realize is that, in fact, we do need to engage more vigorously with the UNFCCC. And that this is really important because the Climate Change Convention has a very strong development focus. And we know that, especially in the Global South, biodiversity is very critical at the local and national levels in terms of the economies. And so if you have development that is not yielding inclusive wealth, you're going to have serious impacts on people's livelihoods. And also you're going to have serious threats on biodiversity. And we already see the evidence of these threats on the biodiversity. We see these massive and destructive forest fires. We see the impact on coral reefs and also the impact on species, especially those species that are not able to keep pace with the velocity of climate change. So we realize that having greater coordination between biodiversity and climate conventions is really, really important because climate change has serious impacts on biodiversity. So we've started to look at this issue and to see how we can give greater attention to the actions that are working. What are local communities doing? What are indigenous communities doing with respect to protecting, to restoring, and also enhancing biodiversity? And what is working at the local level? And how can we learn and benefit from those lessons and experiences? So some of the things in reflecting that we think, we need to focus on, and I think that one of the points was raised, I think it was, I can't remember, Teresa, that raised this issue, that the first thing that we really need to do when we look at reducing the threats of climate change to biodiversity has to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all sources. Whether these are fossil fuels, from deforestation, from food production systems, or, animal production and all those things. That's the first prize. And unless we can do that, we will start to look at nature as the provider of solutions to problems that are being created in pursuit of, so-called development. So this is really the first thing. And if we accept that this is what needs to be done, then we have to start to interrogate some of the solutions that we've been seeing in terms of climate change. And already these have been mentioned. So the issues of carbon offsetting through, for example, these monocultures, creating plantations in the global south. We know the impact of these. We know that they lead to destruction of natural forests, of ecosystems. We know that these solutions, they require large tracts of land, as was mentioned. And one of the consequences of that is, of course, land grabs and the impacts that this has on communities, especially those that don't have secure land tenure. So this can be really, really very destructive. So we need to interrogate and engage with some of these so-called solutions and approaches. And the other thing is this obsession with carbon and a single focus on carbon. And we know that when we focus on carbon, we neglect the importance of species diversity, the importance of ecosystem integrity. And so as a result, those ecosystems that are rich in species but have low sequestration values tend to get destroyed. So this is really important that we look at those issues. And for us, this became very important that we need to be in the climate change space. We need to be able to raise these issues with the climate change community. We need to have mature discussions to ensure that many of these solutions that are being proposed that actually have harmful impacts on biodiversity and people's livelihoods actually don't get replicated. So the issue is when we are pursuing these solutions or approaches that are damaging our biodiversity and the impacts of people, the part of the explanation, I think, lies in this blind adoption of concepts that are not contextualized. So these solutions are sold to us. We adopt them. We don't question them. We don't interrogate them. And they don't fit into the context that a lot of the local communities live in. And we need to begin to challenge this. And we need to ask, how do we begin to identify some of these solutions that are working at the ground? What are some of the agroecological projects that have a potential to ensure that there is a balance in the trade-offs between the need for development and the need to ensure that we don't undermine the biodiversity that in itself is the very basis of our economic development. How do we bring in agroforestry approaches into the food production system and into the landscapes, and issues of sustainable forest management and the contribution that sustainable forest management can make to conservation enhancement of carbon. And often, many of these projects like REDD+, they tend to put carbon as the primary benefit of these interventions, when in fact we need to make greater investment in issues of governance, strengthening local governance systems, investing more in biodiversity conservation, and in ensuring that we're not separating people from nature, because it is the local people and the local communities that understand the complexity of managing biodiversity and its contribution to our livelihoods. So I think that it's important as we engage in these discussions that we have this perspective. So one of the things that we don't do a lot, especially when we come into our engagement with the UNFCCC, is bringing into those discussions how the local communities cope with the threats of climate change to biodiversity. I think what we need to do is more and more to embrace indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and to share the lessons, especially of things that are working, interventions that are working at the local level, to build from the bottom up, and to see how we can bring formal science and traditional knowledge, closer together. How can we support those efforts to ensure that we're not just informed by so-called science, but that local knowledge and traditional knowledge is also informing many of these interventions, and that we can project and share these lessons of what is working at the local level. Many of the carbon projects come with the promise of money, and I think that many of us are guilty of following the money, and we jump onto bandwagons because there is this sense that there's going to be a lot of money. Communities are promised that they'll benefit and they'll receive huge payments, in their engagement with some of these these climate change solutions. I think we need to start to resist this attempt to just following money at the expense of biodiversity conservation and long-term resilience of society and nature. I think we need to think more long-term than just sort of the short-term immediate benefits of getting some short-term project funding. I think lastly, we must hold each other to account in terms of our actions. especially those actions that are harmful to humanity and to nature. And we need to hold our governments to account and to make sure that it is not the private sector and that it's not the markets that are the ones driving this agenda, and that they are the ones that are defining social, safeguards or environmental safeguards, but that it has to be the government that must play that role to regulate and to ensure that the markets don't become rogue, and that the private sector is not using greenwashing as an entry into this particular space. And I think as civil society, we have a role to ensure that we are holding our governments to account and not just ourselves to account. So those are some of the perspectives that I just wanted to share, Gadia. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and being connected. I know that for many reasons, I said that at the beginning, and we're very privileged for being here, for sharing again. The COVID pandemic, if gave us a lot of reflections. Among them is to really enjoy the privilege and be more aware of this privilege. It's not a right to travel and to be somewhere else, but we consume emissions. We risk even our lives in this point in time with our health, etc. So I thank you very much, Yemi, for being connected, and thank you all for being here again. So the next round, we're gonna use the time and use the experience, the vast experience of Pat to give us some reflections in this multilateral space of some of his experience. If you can be, since we don't have much more time, just please be as concise as you can. But we didn't want to miss. To go without your reflections. Then we're going to ask Sridhar and Hemanta to give us some concrete examples, to bring all these multilateral things to the ground. What do they mean in the real life? And then we will finally have a final wrap up by Azad and his experience, but also by some of the panelists who may want to say some other words finalizing this. And hopefully, if time allows, some questions or reflections from those who are online or those who are here with us. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will be fast, and let me try to describe what I think is a success of civil society related to fighting back from the agribusiness over the years, and try to project where we've been and where we're going, and also the strategies now being presented by agribusiness to really, because they haven't succeeded in controlling the technologies in the way they wanted to try to control the structures of governance of agriculture in the world. So we can go back to, we shouldn't say in terms of technology that this is new. Back in the 1920s, the biggest seed company in the world was General Electric. General Electric became a seed company because they discovered radiation technologies and thought that they could sell more X-ray machines to radiate genetic changes in crops to the rest of the world. So they became the biggest plant breeder for a while. Then they discovered it wasn't going to work, and they gave up on it. When the Green Revolution came along, it inspired the petroleum companies, the fossil fuel companies, to move into agriculture in a big way, because they saw that the new Green Revolution varieties in the 1960s, 1970s were going to require, they thought, more fertilizers and pesticides. That was their stock and trade. And so suddenly, for a period of years, Royal Dutch Shell bought more than 100 seed companies around the world and became the world's largest seed company. Didn't work as well as they had hoped it would. So they backed out of it again, and that caused a crash among many small family seed companies and created a crisis for access to seeds for some years. Following that, the hope was that there'd be something called biotechnology that would create the opportunity for control of the first link in the food chain, control of the seeds. And we first worried in 1981 in civil society that the strategy that we were seeing, which was of pesticide companies buying seed companies, meant that, of course, their research would be to make sure that their plant varieties required pesticides. We said that in 1981, when the new biotech seeds first came into the marketplace in the middle of the 1990s. Lo and behold, they had developed herbicide-tolerant plant varieties, genetically engineered plant varieties that needed their herbicides. Not a surprise. And another failure for the companies, because they crashed into the opposition of civil society, around the world, challenging that strategy, and they've been very confined in their ability to make progress there. It was also an extremely expensive and extremely sloppy technology, and that was embarrassing for them, that it just didn't really do much and didn't really work very well. By the end of the 1990s, it was quite clear that they would move on to another space, and the space that was predicted by civil society was that they would move into what we called then intragenetics. They would manipulate the DNA of a plant variety to change its characteristics by gene manipulation, not by moving a gene from one species to another, which was very embarrassing. So they went for intragenetic manipulation. Well, it was a theory. They didn't come out with it until a few years ago, and they call it again gene editing now. It's the same idea. There's CRISPR-Cas9, all these phrases we've been hearing about to edit the DNA itself, which I thought would be less embarrassing in the media, easier to get through governments, get by the farmers as well, and still control the marketplace. Now they're running into trouble with gene editing and the strategies around synthetic biology, thanks to the CBD Alliance and other allies around the world who've been fighting that in the Biodiversity Convention and in the UN Committee on World Food Security as well. That doesn't stop them pursuing that strategy, but the opposition is at least growing in it. While they were doing that, they moved on to look at biodigital information, digital sequencing information. How can we control the information flows around living materials, especially in agriculture, to dominate the marketplace? Which again created a new space that we were beyond the time of Monsanto. We're into the world then of Amazon and Google and Microsoft and other companies who specialized in digital knowledge, specialize in controlling that knowledge and how to sell it to farmers, take it from farmers and control agriculture that way. So that is where we're in the struggle now. But again, they've had another problem, which is that embarrassingly enough, while they've been dominating the food chain, especially the beginning of the food chain for decades, they're in a situation where they've had 4 food crises in 22 years in this century. And all those food crises, there's never been a shortage of food. It just couldn't get to where it was supposed to be, couldn't feed people. And it was, again, a system which benefited them with higher prices, and harmed farmers with lower prices, and still left us with hunger on the planet and greater obesity and all. We know all that story. There is now a sense of alarm in agribusiness and agribusiness now writ large, meaning major digital management companies, that they may not have the successes they wanted to have. What we've seen with the pandemic especially is that they can't control their own supply chains. That the supply chains that they're proposing for the food system keep falling apart. Because like everything else, if you can't get access to microchips, it's not just our cars that can't drive, it is also that they can't make pesticides. We can't manipulate the fertilizers. There's some of the demands, if you want to make, for example, brake fluid in Korea for Korean cars, you need the same urea that the Russian fertilizer industry needs for fertilizers. So who wins the battle to get access to those things? We found a dozen different places where the supply chain that what they thought was simple and straightforward actually hasn't been working. So a crisis for them and a great embarrassment. So while that strategy goes on, the battle around controlling those technologies and making sure the right technologies get to the marketplace is still with us and will continue to be with us for some time to come. Civil society has been able to keep up with the strategies they've been proposing. It was really via Campesina, for example, that was the first to identify the issue of biodigital information and how important it was going to be. And it was wonderful to see that kind of leadership and research capacity coming from peasant organizations. But the second strategy, and I'll end with this, is a move we've seen in the last couple of years led by the World Economic Forum and supported by the UN itself, which says we need to have a new governance structure. We can't control the technologies. We're worried about the crisis in food that we can't seem to stop, and that's going to get public reactions to that. We need to manipulate governance. So we need to have a group that works together better than the United Nations does. We need to avoid that. It's just too many countries. It's just too messy. We can't sit down and talk frankly with each other. We need an environment in which we have multi-stakeholder partnerships. Multi-stakeholder partnerships sounds good. We get a meeting together, we get together, not individual companies, we get their trade associations together. Trade associations are led by the biggest companies, of course. and they're the ones at the table, together with representative countries. Maybe not G20 is a bit too big, a bit messy too there, but maybe we can get a group of regional representatives, perhaps 7 or 14 or so countries together that can be around the table with us, which we have the biggest countries and the weakest countries so we can control the votes. Then, of course, to make it look better, besides having the corporations at the table and having key leading governments at the table, we need to have civil society there. And so we look for the softest, gentlest, most bought off, paid for civil society we can find and invite them to come to the table. Those who sort of fell into the Stockholm syndrome. They fell in love with the United Nations and being controlled by government or corporations. So those are the ones who are going to then meet, but of course they'll involve the United Nations. They'll do as they've done with COVAX and the pandemic experience, which is they'll decide for themselves, they'll come back with their solutions, and the United Nations will ratify those solutions, which of course the United Nations does by never voting, but simply smiling for the photographs. And that is the strategy that's underway now. One, to manipulate the control of the information around agribusiness in the food system, and has moved into a more scarier version of that. And secondly, to change the governance system of the food system where the corporations really are in control. The latest move, scariest of all, around the control of this information is to really leave it in the hands of the big asset management companies. You know that if we have 3 companies in the world, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. BlackRock itself has almost $10 trillion in assets that it manages. Vanguard's around, I think it's around $8 trillion, and I think State Street's a bit below that. But they together, each one of them, literally, but especially BlackRock, has significant investments in shares in every single agribusiness on the planet. It's a publicly traded company. So when they sit around the table to negotiate with each other, or to merge, or do whatever else they'd like to do, it's really BlackRock that can walk around the back of the table, see the negotiators, see the cards they're holding, because they have those cards as well, determine who's going to win the game. So the food system has gone from where we talk about Monsanto and the fears about Monsanto, or before that, a century ago, General Electric. We're now in a situation where it's really the asset management companies that are really trying to determine the fate and the future of our food supply. When I first got into this work almost half a century ago, we used to go around saying that the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, shouldn't be a prayer to Monsanto. Now, we have to worry about praying to BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard.
Thank you so much, Pat, for sharing your experience, walking us through the history of the multilateral space and all these kind of practices and strategies these big companies, these big players use against them, that is repeated, and we have to foresee them and be aware of. And connected to that experience, I'd like to ask to our colleagues and friends to share your experience on the ground. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. You have the timer there that can guide you a little bit, but your experience is very relevant. Can we start with Hemanta then, or yes? Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Multilateralism, that's how Stockholm Convention was introduced. Since then, there are many conventions, many protocols, many international conferences happen. Here we are talking about Convention on Biodiversity, UNFCCC, Desertification Convention, and all of them. They produce various tools for our countries to respect. Now, for example, under the UNFCCC, you have the national determined contributions, which we should supposed to implement in our own countries. Biodiversity action plans and various other tools we have. Now suddenly you have a control of each of these countries through the various financial mechanisms. Of course, when it comes to the climate, you talk about the Green Climate Fund, but beyond that you have the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and all of them. And also now we have the bilateral financing like the Chinese financing and the European financing and various other financing mechanisms. What our countries do, borrowing money all the time for implementing infrastructure and even implementing the environmental solutions. Now, suddenly, my country, Sri Lanka, is in an economic crisis. We are supposed to pay back $56 billion in the next 3 decades. And this year alone, we are supposed to pay $7 billion US. Because of the COVID situation, Sri Lanka didn't get enough tourists. People who are working in the Middle Eastern countries, so they were unable to send money. And our production systems, textiles and everything collapsed. And therefore, suddenly we found, almost like more than a year ago, we found there's no foreign remittance, there's simply no dollars to buy things. What our government did originally, this was about 1.5 years ago, they say no imports of vehicles. Of course, we are very happy that's not going to affect us. But then suddenly they decided no palm oil importation from Indonesia. We were happy because we have the coconut oil. Then suddenly they say, we are not going to import chemical fertilizer because we don't have money to pay. And overnight they decided that, okay, you convert into the organic farming. And our people were not ready. There was no adequate organic fertilizer produced in the country. You know, of course, many of our countries, organic fertilizer means converted municipal waste into the fertilizer. So that's not adequate. That doesn't bring adequate nitrogen into the soil. So our agriculture start collapsing. We have been talking about food sovereignty, food security, and this kind of beautiful language for many, many years. But suddenly we saw overnight our agriculture is completely destroyed by the government. And suddenly they thought, okay, nitrogen is a problem. They started importing nano nitrogen from India. And we say, it's not going to work. Then they started importing organic fertilizer from China. It's a shipload of organic fertilizer came from one of the provinces. It's a municipal waste. But we found there are at least 2 microorganisms which is very harmful for our soil, which is not available in our soil. So we stopped this shipment by filing legal action. Then still it was around Sri Lankan ocean, almost like 2 months. But then our government had to pay about more than $6 million US for this shipment alone. So suddenly we found that we don't have money to buy fossil fuel. We have been talking about renewable energy, public transport system, all these beautiful ideas, but suddenly there's no money for paying for the oil, diesel. And right now we are facing that there are long queues along all the petrol stations for diesel, petrol, motorcycles, 3-wheelers, cars, tipper lorries. Everything is in line, sometimes 3 days, 4 days, just waiting for the bouncers to come and pump petrol. So suddenly we found there's no money for LPG gas. So the whole urban system has collapsed because they don't have money. They don't have LPG gas. And suddenly people look for kerosene oil for cooking, but then kerosene oil is also not available. In those areas, you cannot find firewood. Definitely in the urban setup, you cannot have the firewood cooking. So the whole system collapsed. Then there's no diesel. There's no coal. We cannot buy any coal. So therefore, our electric system collapsed. And at the beginning, I think there were 14-hour power cuts. But suddenly, because of the rain, we started getting bit hydropower. Still, we have about 5-hour power cuts. You know, the problem is that although we are supposed to respect to all these international discussions, international agreements, etc., surviving at the national level is a problem. Now we found that our politicians have looted a lot of money from public money. Many of the money came for some infrastructure projects, which Lydia has been talking about, illegitimate debt for many, many years. It has already happened in my country. Some 400 million US dollars came for an irrigation project, completely missing. The project is not there, but the money has already spent. And there are certain infrastructure projects. 1 kilometer of infrastructure may be around 2 billion in Sri Lankan rupees, but they have spent about 7 billion for this particular kilometer, 1 kilometer. So where the money has gone? So the money, according to the people think that, so they have invested, the politicians, especially the big family who has about 8 politicians in the same family in this parliament. So they have looted this money, the corrupt money. Now it has gone to spend buying things in Uganda and Seychelles and Dubai and Australia and all these countries. Now, when a situation like that comes, the people are suffering right now. We are having a whole civil space is limiting for us, and starting last 52 days, the people are on the streets, some people are struggling, and at one point the government somehow organized people to come and attack this people's struggle, but then the other people came and protected the local the people who are in the people's struggle, but then started burning houses in politicians' houses. It's chaos right now. And now the government say, we still don't have money to buy fertilizer. Maybe within next 2-3 weeks time, you may reduce your 3 meals to 2 meals. That's the kind of democratic governments we have at the moment. Now, when I share this story with our people, our people from the other region, from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and all of this, say we are following the same path. At one point, I remember the Malaysian chief Mahathir Mohamad said, "Don't learn from Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka has a lot of debt to China. China's 10% debt to China, and there are other countries, many countries, World Bank, ADB, of course, they are there. Now our government has gone to the IMF, and the IMF say, you have to have a legitimate government. And they believe that this government is not legitimate. So we are in a real trouble. Now the IMF is not coming. And yesterday I saw the news that the government has requested about 700 million from US dollar from World Bank, and they have refused. And now who is going to be the savior? That's very important. It's going to be the debt for nature swap. That's the proposal coming under the UNEP in Sri Lanka. So they are asking some NGOs to come and buy some debt, Nordic Bank to come and buy some debt, Chinese government to convert some of them. And it's interesting that when we say that we had a criticism about the Chinese money, and some people say, we should not treat the Chinese debt, the Chinese loans like the same comes from the other places. But right now, China is not ready to do the debt restructuring. So they say, okay, you have to pay back. If you cannot pay back, get a bigger loan and then you pay back that money. So now we are in a real chaos. I don't know, the civil space is very, very limited at the moment. Starting last week, they have started arresting Buddhist monks and the activists. Any moment, it can be a military situation in Sri Lanka. So what the people will do if they don't have enough food to eat? Now, that's the big problem we have to ask from all over the world, where the southern countries mostly have the problems with, when it comes down to the not having 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day. And so one of the daughter this morning shared that some of the infants died, her cousin died because you cannot find a liter of petrol for the motorcycle. It's happening almost every day in Sri Lanka. So it's so bad, and so many people have committed suicide. Now we have all these big conferences, all these last 50 years. We have the SDG goals, we have all other agreements, but unfortunately, when it comes to the local people suffering from lack of food because of transportation, because of the high debt and all of those, so what can we do? I think that's the reality. We have to bring here when you are making the decision making. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manta. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sridhar. I come from Delhi in India, and I came from 47 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine, 1 degree is making such a huge difference to our lives. And what I say may be, controversial, but it's true that we as a society gave ourselves an opium called the United Nations, and we gave ourselves the steroids in the name of multilateral development banks. If we sit down calmly and think, we had the Kyoto Protocol 50 years ago. We here in Stockholm, and our own Indian Prime Minister's speech was very moving, and we said poverty is also a big environmental issue. We continued, but 50 years we have been lulled into this opium of one convention after the other. And if you take even the CBD 10 years ago, the Nagoya, not a single thing has moved, right? And what we have found time and again is we fail something, we fail the Kyoto Protocol, and then we say, no, we'll have a Paris Agreement. Then we'll have a Glasgow Declaration. So every decade we renew the convention, but no action. But what is the action that takes place? That is the steroid. Like, it might sound absolutely funny, but it's a real thing that recently we were evaluating a commercial hatchery project funded by the Asian Development Bank. Now, it says that the ruminants cause more methane, whereas the chicken doesn't cause as much methane emission, and therefore, it's a climate investment. A regular commercial hatchery project, which should have been funded by a commercial bank, is taken over by a multilateral development bank, and it comes up with a very skewed kind of analysis and says that this is a climate finance. So what we are coming up to is a situation that where today we are finding that as crisis continues in Sri Lanka, as Indonesia has increased the kind of duties on palm oil, India has the Northeast, which is largely indigenous communities, rainforests, where now we have decided that 500,000 acres of land will put into oil palm. Not only that, as a corollary to having this oil palm, we have already started a biorefinery with carbon capture, which will use the natural bamboo in that area to convert it into energy, and whatever the kind of emissions are there, we'll trap that. And this is being supported. This research and effort is being supported by some Finnish finance. So what we are finding is that the opioids, the multilateral development banks, go ahead and invest or create the investment climate, which then the Black Rocks and the various other people follow in, and scale it up. That's what is the language that goes on, that we have to scale this all up. So with the result that today we are in a very, very strange situation that when the world is more and more dependent on biodiversity, whether it's for health, whether it's for feeding ourselves, the worst thing is, like yesterday I was in a panel looking at monitoring systems, And when we were discussing about food monitoring systems, we didn't know where the problem emerged when there was a diarrhea in the children in the Himalayas. Whether it was the genetically modified seed, the brinjal that the children had, or whether it was something which was in the soil, whether it was so whatever tests or today's tests only go to the last sample, and so we don't have a linkage of the custody of the sample also, and we don't know where the actual impact has begun. So we are faced now with a situation that we are dramatically reducing our biodiversity, on which our future depends. And at the same time, we are pushing for, you heard all the kind of false solutions that are being, perpetrated. And in this kind of a scene, the only kind of way is how do we seriously question these kind of conventions which lull us into thinking that something is happening and something is happening collectively. And how do we stop these people who are financing this kind of a destruction? And I hope collectively we'll all be able to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those incredible reflections, that very well needed reality check that we have to do, especially when we talk about these multilateral vague spaces. Thank you. With no further delay, and because we have very few minutes left, I will have Asad, when his experience, to help us connect the dots. And let's see if we can have some time of some reflections or questions from the people who are here. But Asad, please.
Thank you. My name's Asad Rahman. I'm from War on Want. We're based in the UK, but we work with social movements across the global south and frontline communities against extractivism, for the right to food sovereignty, right to housing, against occupation and settler colonialism, etc. And we've been working for many decades, amplifying the voice of the global south, and I suppose, well, at least within the UK context, been labelled the most radical of the NGOs that operate there, because we like to speak truth to power. I was just reflecting on all of these things, and when we are all collectively now, I think especially after the last 2.5 years, where movements have not had a chance to have conversations together, we think, of course, it's rocket science, right? You join the dots between the environment, economy, and the economic growth and human well-being. And 50 years ago, of course, that's exactly what Stockholm 50 did. And there was a reason, of course, why it did that. Yes, there were movements, and there was a space within the political discourse, at least in some countries in the global north, here in Sweden and others, but also there was a very powerful global south, right? There was a non-aligned movement. There was unity and leadership in the global south that said that's exactly the conference we want, because it speaks to the relationship, the economic and political relationship between the global north and the global south, right? And we have to say it did amazing things, right? I mean, it spawns the UNEP, right? It's the first institution that's based in the global south. I mean, a trying an attempt to rebalance the global architecture that has been created after the Second World War and move it away from just being dominated by the global north into the global south. And of course, and then in 1988, UNEP births the IPCC, and we begin the cycle of the climate science reports. And of course, from that, we get the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And to some extent, the things that we want a convention on climate, we want a convention on biodiversity, we want a convention on desertification. These are all really, really important things. And actually, if you look back at that moment, obviously the global north has spent probably 50 years now, 30, 40 years, trying to dismantle the thing that they agreed in 1992 in this, they must have been smoking something, because they allowed certain principles to be in there, right? They allowed the principles of historical responsibility, of common differentiated responsibility, all of these, the idea of polluter pays, all of these ideas, which of course then decades have been spent to try and dismantle that and shift responsibility for action from the global north to the global south. Look, the moment when we had Stockholm 50 and the crisis then is amplified now, right? We've got climate, we've got instability, biodiversity loss, pollution, waste, inequality, imbalance. We all recognize all of those things are absolutely happening. And of course, again, the IPCC report that just the reports that just recently came out, set that out very, very clearly in stark language. Ecosystems are on the brink of collapse. Once we breach 1.5, the losses will be irreversible. These are the very ecosystems that the majority of people in the global south, particularly the poorest, rely on in terms of for their livelihoods and survival. And and talked about the need for a social compacts on climate and poverty, etc., etc., etc. We all, again, it's not rocket science. We know what we need to do. We've heard if you want to tackle the climate crisis, of course, we say we have to transform our energy system in all that it entails, the food system, and of course protect our ecosystems. And these are the three things. But the problem is, of course, you can't do those without thinking about the context in which the economy in which they're based, right? And that has been the most fundamental issue, I think, in terms of the crisis of multilateralism, right? Because to some extent, I sort of disagree with, people who say, oh, look at the UNFCCC, they're all waste of time. We're having 26 COPs. Look, why don't they ever deliver what we need to do? I do worry because we're trying to be, I suppose, a little bit defensive in the sense we're still trying to defend multilateral spaces because their solution, of course, is to do exactly as Pat says, right? Is to do closed door between multi-stakeholder corporations, a few handful of governments, and none of us being even part of, or at least any visibility or any transparency in terms around that. And we know that the reason why we've not delivered the outcomes in any of those things, one, is fundamentally always comes back to a question of power, our ability to be able to affect processes both at a local, national level, and therefore at a global level. It's no good, of course, trying to affect them at a global level without us also affecting our own government at a national level. And again, this is not rocket science. We all know that these things need to happen, but to some extent, I think one of the challenges is I always say they're playing three-dimensional chess with us, right? They play like they know what they're trying to do, which is to protect the economic model as it is, and then say, how within that paradigm do we solve these different crises? And each of them, trying to solve it within that, leads to these madcap ideas, right? Leads to trying the net zero idea, leads to the idea you can dial up the temperature and then try and dial it back down, like madness. It leads to ideas like saying, well, actually, we could use the market to be solutions for all of those things, even though the empirical evidence, not ideological, the empirical evidence is that none of it is actually working. And as we know, it's not. Temperatures levels are increasing, biodiversity losses is off the charts, etc., and global inequality, etc., is also at incredible and historic levels. Now, when I think about that ticking clock of the carbon budget for 1.5, right, and if we were genuinely thinking about that carbon budget, we'd be saying 5 years, right? Probably, yeah. If we were being a bit more, willing to be a bit more relaxed about it. Of course, a luxury in the global north because we're not the ones that will pay the price of that margin. Then it's maybe 10 years. But we already know, as we heard, I'm originally from Pakistan. I spoke to my family. We've got 53 degrees temperature in Pakistan. 53 degrees. And this is not a one-off. This has been the third heat wave in every couple of years. And the government's response has been to dig mass graves, right? This is not people who have got an opportunity to be able to say, let me go home, put the air conditioning on, or let me go to a fountain or eat some ice cream. We're talking about people who have absolutely no choice but to be out in the fields working, absolutely no choice but to be in those conditions. And, we know that temperature level is roughly what, Death Valley in the US is. The reason it's called Death Valley is, of course, human beings can't tolerate that kind of heat out in the open. So we know that gamble that they're doing is calculated, right? It's always calculated. When I used to work following the UNFCCC negotiations for many more years than I would like to admit to. You know, I still remember being sitting in meetings with European policymakers and European civil society, and the discussion when we fought for limit temperatures to well below 1 degree, and they were arguing for temperatures are safe at 2 degrees. The idea that was implicit within that, which was actually you can gamble with some people's lives, and you can gamble with some parts of our ecosystem. You can gamble because, as I used to be told, I said, you've got to learn to live within the system. Right? That's your problem. You're not willing to live within the system. And of course, what you're hearing here, of course, is that system is actually killing people. And it's very hard to be able to say, if you're in Sri Lanka now and you've been told you've got no food, no energy, no etc., or whether you're in India, Pakistan, or anywhere else in the world, right? In Brazil, live within that system. People we know can't. And in these last 2 years, I just want to think, you know, when they play three-dimensional chess with us, I'm sorry, I've just got all these images in my mind. You know, I always think, you know, okay, they're playing three-dimensional chess, right? But there's odds on there. Well, maybe they're playing Russian roulette with us on all of these. They say really mad things, and then they dial it down, and they put something else. But, you know, in Russian roulette, it's usually one chamber has got the bullet in, the others haven't. And they're playing with the idea that actually there's bullets in every single chamber. And no matter what we stop, and it's important we do stop them, they have another bullet somewhere else already immediately able to go. So I think we're being told to shut up. So you know, the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic, I think has been really illustrative, right? Of course, both the hypocrisy of how the global north talked about the pandemic. We all remember no one is safe until everyone is safe, etc. We'll all build back better, etc. And of course, we see vaccine apartheid. We saw the global north compete with the global south for everything from life-saving treatment, and continuing at the WTO just down the road here, continuing to block even now vaccine treatment. Why? Because of course the big pharmaceutical companies are making $1,000 profit each and every second, and they want to be able to protect that. Now, in that moment, you know, this is why I find Stockholm 50 an important moment for us as a movement, because here is the first time we're able to begin to discuss actually what does that COVID recovery look like. Now, you know, we've heard for 2 years or 2.5 years, we saw it in the G7 and the G20, we saw Biden talking about it, but there's never been an opportunity for us to actually be able to engage. And we know the data, less money is going to low carbon development, to sustainable development in the COVID recovery now than it did in 2018. That in this last year alone, the billionaires, the 2,883 billionaires in this world amassed an incredible 16 trillion in additional wealth. At the very same time as the poorest people in the world, workers in the world, lost $13 trillion in lost income because factory gates were shut on them. So there is a profound challenge I think we have got. So I'm going to shut up. I think this is, Arundhati Roy says this very, very well. She talks about, you know, what they've done is woven a tapestry, right? And in this tapestry of all, you have to unpick 1,000 threads of all these injustices. But there are threads that, like a jumper, that if you unpick them, they unravel much more. And that is partly what, you know, many of us, and Liddy and us, you know, for decades have been trying to talk about how do we have a response which is a set of people's demands that can go between these different spaces, that our movement can be more than the individual part, that we're not simply about resisting all of these things, but we're also about positively putting forward our vision of what do we want. And we know what we want. We know living wages, social protection, universal services, all of these things. Again, not from an ideological point of view, because actually the science and data shows that they are the most important mitigation efforts. They're the most important adaptive measures, the most important fact to deliver, to tackle inequality. But fundamentally, a link between all of those demands and what's happening in these multilateral spaces is a question about governance and who controls and democratic control. And if we want to change our energy system, it has to be democratically controlled. If we want to change our governance and our multilateral system, then the fight about democracy within these spaces is as critical. Okay, shut up. Sorry.